Well, thank you for being here. This presentation is similar to the one as I did in January, exactly 2 months ago. This has been 50 years in the making since I got interested in public policy issues when I was a graduate student at Rutgers and wrote a dissertation on inflation, which I discussed in January, Are You Prepared for the Crash of 2029? So if it's still on the YouTube page, I urge you to watch it. So today's topic is the federal budget and the Constitution, the great disconnect. And as you see, we will go through the key elements of the federal budget, what the Constitution says is authorized for the federal government to spend, and see if that's consistent. Because every member of Congress, members of the President's administration, members of the Supreme Court take an oath to uphold the Constitution. So that is really the issue as far as I'm concerned, because I took an oath to uphold the Constitution in 1959 when I became a U.S. citizen in Lower Manhattan. So I think I've been faithful to the Constitution in advocating policies that are consistent. So let's go through this. This is today's agenda, okay? So we'll be here for the next 4 hours, so hopefully it won't cut into your dinner time. Federal government spending, deficits, debt, and taxes. Article 1, Section 8, we'll talk about that. The 5th, 10th, 16th, and 18th Amendments. The history of social spending. The trends of military spending, what has gone wrong, and creating a constitutional budget. So let's go through this, okay? Okay, federal spending since 1965. Why did I start in 1965? Very simple. That's when President Johnson said, we are going to have a great society in America. And we're going to have not only butter, the domestic spending side of policy, but we're also going to have guns for the Vietnam War. I remember distinctly being in my apartment on July 30th, I think it was, 1965, when he announced 100,000 or so troops are going to Vietnam to quell the rebellion there that was going on between the North and the South. That obviously didn't work out too well since the U.S. left in April of 1975. 10 years and 58,000 Americans dead and about 2 million Southeast Asians dead. And today Vietnam is our friend, unified under one government. And you can see the spending has increased. Whoops, sorry, take that back. That's, whoops. Spending has increased dramatically since then. So if we go to 1965, we see that spending has been on a steady rise. My point is, it doesn't matter whether it's a Democrat or Republican in the White House, whether the Republicans or the Democrats control the Congress, spending keeps on going up. Now, the interesting thing about this, which Republicans won't tell you about, look at this. The budget was flat. That socialist, President Obama, was in office. That was sarcasm. Because there were Republicans controlling the Congress. The point I'm making is when you have a divided government, spending seems to be fairly under control. That is what history is showing us regarding the budget. Then when we look at 2019, 2020, this is the COVID spike, where we had a Republican president. And you can see spending went from $4 trillion annually to nearly $7 trillion in a blink of an eye. The federal budget increased by $3 trillion in about a year or so. An enormous amount of money because of the lockdowns. First at the federal level, then the states had their own lockdowns. And then spending receded a little bit after the COVID emergency was declared under control, and then spending has gone up again. This is in line with the thesis of a great economist and historian, Robert Higgs, who wrote a fantastic book in the late 80s called Crisis on Leviathan. The thesis of his book, and he spelled out in 400 pages, every time there's a crisis, spending spikes. And when the crisis recedes, spending rarely goes down, if ever, to its previous level. So there's a ratcheting up effect of spending because of so-called crises. Okay? And of course, the big crises have been war. So this is federal spending. So if you're a partisan Republican or a partisan Democrat, sorry to hear that. It doesn't matter who's in office. Spending will continue to go up. What about the deficits? Remember, we're supposed to have fiscal responsibility in Washington. And you can see the boxed area. Before we get to that, we can see the deficit started increasing in the late 70s under Nixon, Ford, and then Carter, Republicans and Democrats. And then under the fiscal responsible conservative administration of Ronald Reagan, sarcasm again, we had deficits, perpetual deficits in the 1980s. And then the deficits started going, to zero, and then we had surpluses under Bill Clinton, the last 3 years of the Clinton administration, because the Republicans took control of Congress. So the lesson here is divided government gives us more fiscal responsibility than one-party government. That's the lesson of what the charts are telling us. Now look what's happened to the deficits. We reached nearly $3.2 trillion during COVID, and I'll get into what last year's deficit was. So you can see, things are not looking good for deficit reduction. Okay. So let's go to the next slide, which is debt, federal debt. If you have deficits, you have accumulated debt. And what did I put here? Because of the surpluses under Clinton, the debt didn't rise at all in 2000, and since then it's been going up, up, and up. The scary part of this chart is that the debt was $4 trillion in 2000, and now I just hit $39 trillion. Again, the point is the debt is reaching what some people would call a fiscal cliff. How much further can the debt go before the potential buyers of debt say, no more, we're not taking on any more debt? So this is the debt since 1965, and it's not going to recede at all because, as we'll see, the deficits are approaching, and this is the fiscal year of 2026, President Trump's first full budget since he was elected in November of 2024. We may have more than a $2 trillion deficit this year. Okay, what about receipts? The taxes that we pay to the federal government. And you can see it was basically minuscule in the early part of the 20th century. When did it increase? We had a spike. You can't see it here because the way the chart is created. And this, by the way, is from the Federal Reserve Economic Database of the St. Louis Fed. So it's not my chart, it's the Federal Reserve chart, which gets the data from other government organizations. So you can see that the receipts have been going up, up and up and up. And what happened here? It went from $1 trillion in roughly 1990 to $5 trillion. And we're still running a huge deficit. So even though the receipts of the federal government have gone up by fivefold, spending has increased faster, hence the deficits. That's what that means. Okay. And you can see the gray bars here, that's periods of recession. When you have a recession, economic activity slows down, tax receipts go down, and that's why these numbers go down here, 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 and here it just went down a little bit. So the federal government has been spending, taxing, and running these huge deficits under both political parties. Okay, what's one of the drivers of the federal budget? Not the main one, but one of the major ones. And you can see here, the Vietnam War, we got a boost in military spending under Johnson. Then we got the end of the 70s, early 80s. Then we got the buildup during the Reagan administration. Spending went from $200 billion to $400 billion, a stunning increase in military spending. Then after the Berlin Wall came down in 1989, the Soviet Union collapsed, military spending was on a downhill basis. In other words, that was supposedly the peace dividend. The so-called evil empire was gone. We could now take the swords into plowshares, if you want to use a biblical analogy. And we were supposed to concentrate on domestic issues. Well, look what happened. September 11th, 2001. Okay, the attacks on the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and military spending went through the roof from $400 billion to $800 billion by the time Obama was elected in 2008. Then we got another dip in military spending under the Obama administration, and then in Trump's first term, spending went up again, and it's been going up ever since. And the president is now proposing another $200 billion for the Pentagon for the war. I would not say in Iran, I would say on Iran. Okay. So we have the military-industrial complex, we have domestic spending, which I'll go over in a little bit, and we have no willingness on the part of any president or any party in Congress to say we can't afford this anymore. We know we can't run our lives in running perpetual deficits. No business can run its business on perpetual deficits, because who's going to lend them the money? Who's going to buy their stock if they want to issue more stock, or buy their bonds? So we have a real problem, and we'll get into that a little bit more. Okay, this is the interest on the national debt. If this doesn't frighten you, it should, because nations that have incurred huge interest expense on their debt have had major financial crises, and the 20th century is littered with them in Europe, in Asia, Africa, South America. The list of countries that have had hyperinflation, where prices are literally rising by the minute. In some countries that have hyperinflation, you go into a restaurant, there are no printed menus. All the menus are on a blackboard, and they would change every few minutes. Can that happen here? Well, that's what I discussed in January. But this is telling us this is unsustainable, because in 2 years, I believe, interest on the national debt will be the largest component of the federal budget. You can't run your household like that. That interest on your credit card, your mortgage, well, you don't have a mortgage here, is the greatest expense that you have, and it's increasing exponentially. This is the scary part. Okay? We were able to get through this period without a trouble, but this is just remarkable that we've gone from $350 billion to $1 trillion literally overnight. Okay? So if you study the history of public finance over the decades, over the centuries, you'll see that this is the prelude to a major financial crisis. Okay? So this was the big picture for the last 100 some odd years of spending, taxing. And here is the last fiscal year budget. Remember, the fiscal year begins on October 1st and ends September 30th. This is the 2025 budget, part during the Biden administration, part in the Trump administration. And what do we see here? Here are the receipts. We have $5.2 trillion in receipts, which includes income taxes, payroll taxes, corporate taxes, custom duties, excise taxes, and estate taxes, which is a very small part of the budget. If you see here, the estate taxes, we can get rid of it, which would eliminate a lot of estate planning for tax purposes. It's only $29 billion out of $5 trillion. And how much do we spend on accounting and legal fees in order for upper income people to adjust their affairs so they reduce their tax liability? Now, here's the key point of this presentation. Here's all the spending last year, $7 trillion, and we had nearly a $1.8 trillion deficit. What are we spending money on? Social Security, $1.5 trillion, Medicare, nearly $1 trillion, health care, nearly $1 trillion, net interest, nearly $1 trillion, national defense, nearly $1 trillion, income security, veterans benefits, transportation, natural resources, and other. Other looks like the CIA budget. I don't know, but that's I wonder what that other means, but that's a lot of money, $250 billion. That's $20 billion a month that I guess we could do a deep dive into the budget, which is not the purpose of this presentation. We can find out where that money goes. But having $250 billion of other expenditures seems like a lot of money that is not. This comes from the Treasury statement. Every month they issue a statement. And the next one should be coming out, I think, this week for February. Okay. Last thing I want to talk about in this section is the tax rates. The income tax, 16th Amendment. The rates went from 1% to 7%. How many of you would like to pay a 7% income tax? When this was discussed in the country, the proponents of the income tax said, this is going to be a rich man's tax, because the 7% was really on high-income people at the time. 98% of Americans were exempt from the income tax because the threshold was $4,000 a year. In 1913, $4,000 was a lot of money for the average U.S. family. So most people said, hey, sign us up for the income tax. We like the income tax. We're not going to pay for it. It's going to be a rich man's tax. Well, guess what happened 3 years after it was implemented in 1914? By the way, the first income tax form was 4 pages long. You didn't need a CPA or an accountant to fill it out for you. You could do it literally in a few minutes. Well, guess what happened in April 1917? After running for re-election as the peace candidate while Europe was torn by war. Woodrow Wilson, whose campaign theme was, he kept us out of war, declared war on Germany. And rates went from 7% to 77% in a blink of an eye. And the proponents of the income tax said, it's not going any higher. But World War I interrupted that. The income tax rates for the lowest income people didn't go up by much, but it stayed there. Then what happened after World War II, you had a Republican administration coming, the Harding administration, and the Coolidge administration after Harding passed. And under Secretary of Treasury Mellon, rates went from 77% down to 25%. That helped ignite the boom of the 1920s. That was sort of a case study of lowering interest rates, more incentive to produce, to invest, and of course you had the stock market boom as well. Then what happened? The Great Depression hit in 1929. And in 1930, interest rates popped. Republican President Herbert Hoover said we need to increase rates because we have a deficit. So we increased rates, and that further imploded the economy. As rates went up, tax rates went up, it was more difficult for people to plan, and of course, it was a burden on the corporate sector and the individuals. And rates kept on going up under Roosevelt, under FDR, until it reached the peak of 94%. The highest rate during World War II on the top earners was 94%. Ronald Reagan famously said, well, he was a movie actor at the time, he stopped making movies because every extra dollar he made, the federal government would get 94 cents out of every dollar. Well, if 100 cents on a dollar is called slavery, we were very close to having a slave tax system in the 1940s. Then rates went down, then when they went back up. But here's the real point that a lot of economists miss. During this period of very high tax rates, virtually no one paid that exact rate. Why? There were deductions, exemptions, and all sorts of credits that people utilized. So people were paying around 30, 35%, maybe 40% of their income in taxes, not even on the marginal side. Today they're called loopholes, which is not an economic and finance term. It's a political term. Someone's deduction is someone else's what? Loophole. So when you hear the word loophole, they're making a political statement, not an economic analysis statement. And you can see that rates have been coming down. Then, of course, George H.W. Bush, during the 1988 campaign, said, read my lips, no new taxes. Tax rates went up. He became a one-term president. So when you break your promise to the American people, you get punished at the polls. That's what the evidence suggests. And then rates went up. Here, Then they came down in the Bush administration, the second Bush administration. Then they went up under Obama, and I think they've come down. They've come down a little bit under the Trump administration. Instead of having a steady tax rate, the tax code has become a political football by either party, saying we want this deduction, we want this rate, and so on and so forth. And so the tax code right now is, I think, 70,000 pages. I remember it was a Money magazine several decades ago gave information to 10 CPAs to figure out the tax liability of this family. They all came back with 10 different answers. So no one knows what is the proper tax deduction and accurate tax return you can do because of all the components of the tax code. Okay. This is the chart I showed 2 months ago, which I want to show again because the implication of this is what's driving the budget and Federal Reserve monetary policy. So we have government spending and taxation, which we just went over. The Federal Reserve I talked about in January, and regulations is a topic for another day. The mainstream view of economists in America today, of pundits, is that the economy is unstable. This comes out of, believe it or not, Karl Marx writing the Communist Manifesto and his other books in the 19th century. And since the Great Depression, mainstream economists said, you know what, we've had this wonderful economy, but it's not very stable because of the Great Depression, 25% unemployment, a massive drop in production. Therefore, the federal government, because there's so many smart people that go to the federal government and know exactly how to manage the economy, they're going to put the economy on an even keel to prevent recession or inflation. Well, guess what happened in the 1970s? We got both. We got stagflation, right? We have high unemployment in 73, 74, then in 79, 80, 81, and inflation. Economists said you either have one or the other, not both. So their whole approach to economic analysis was flawed. Everyone following this? This is the key to understanding why the economists, 400 of them that work for the Federal Reserve, are spinning their wheels. And we are the what? Victims of their policies giving us inflation and recession. Okay? When I put this chart together, I said this summarizes economic policy since the 1930s. Because if you believe that economic activity is a result of the law of supply and demand, we don't need someone in Washington to try to manage that. We're all here because we want to live in Siena Lakes. We go shopping because we like where we go shopping. We buy the cars that we want, or SUVs, because that's what we want. That's what's called consumer preference. And we alone determine that. Once someone interferes with that, we're going to have what's called distortions. And there are a whole bunch of distortions that we can discuss some other time under regulations, which causes less prosperity, more unemployment, and so on and so forth. Next chart. Okay, so how did we get here? Is all the spending that the federal government does consistent with Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution? This is the first paragraph of Article 1, Section 8. The Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes. So that means it's legal. That doesn't mean it's good for the economy. Duties, imposts, and excises. According to this, the president can't unilaterally increase tariffs, even though there's authority in some legislation that gives the president authority to pay the debts and provide for the common defense. You can see defense was spelled differently back then. They used CE instead of SE. And here's the kicker. This is the key point. And the general welfare of the United States, but all duties, imposts, and excises shall be uniform throughout the United States. Okay. Here's the Constitution and the Declaration. Okay. I've had this for decades. I go through this periodically to see exactly, am I reading this correctly, Article 1, Section 8? Because that's the first sentence. Then if you go to the other sentences in Article 1, Section 8, which has all the authorized activities of the federal government, every single one is spelled out clearly and concisely. There's no ambiguity there. The ambiguity is, what does the general welfare mean? And this is a very important clause in the history of the Supreme Court decisions. I go through Article 1, Section 8 and all the enumerated powers. Nothing is there about retirement income, retirement benefits, social welfare spending, education subsidies, housing subsidies, agricultural subsidies, corporate subsidies, foreign aid. In other words, and we'll see this how important this is regarding the history of spending in the United States and law. So Article 1, Section 8 is pretty clear to me, and it should be to everyone, even though English is not my first language. It doesn't permit the federal government to spend money on things that it's not authorized to do, which means most of the federal budget is unauthorized. This is one of my favorite passages from the Fifth Amendment, some of you that have been attorneys. Nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. Bear in mind, it doesn't say real estate, it says private property. What's your property? Everything that you own. Your stocks, your bonds, your house, your business, your 401k, your IRA, the money in your savings account, money market fund, and the money under your mattress. That's your property. It doesn't say real estate. And in 1985, law professor Richard Epstein wrote a book called Takings. And he has an interesting passage about taxes. He said, if we really apply the Fifth Amendment, if the government taxes us, takes our property, right? It has to provide us something in return. Here's the real problem from an economic point of view. Well, some people will argue, well, the government is giving us services for our taxes. But from an economic point of view, what are those taxes, what are those services worth? We know what they cost, but what are they worth? Something has worth because we decide what it should be valued at. So if you go to an auction, the members of the audience determine what the Picasso will sell for, or the Mickey Mantle card, or any other thing. It's not the government, it's the people determine it. That's called subjective value. And that governs the economy, okay? Now what about the next 10th Amendment? This is one of the most powerful amendments in the Constitution. It's part of the Bill of Rights. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. So in other words, if the states want to do retirement benefits, they can do so if their constitutions allow them to do it. This is probably the most forgotten amendment in the Constitution. Most people are not aware of it. Most people in Congress are, I think, are not aware of it either. Because this tells them you cannot spend money that's not authorized. Leave it to the states or the people to do it. Okay? Why do we have a 16th Amendment, which the Secretary of State in February 1913 said is official? It's part of the U.S. Constitution. The Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes on incomes from whatever source derived, without apportionment among several states and without regard to any census or enumeration. Okay? In other words, the income tax is legal. It's now authorized by the Constitution. The question is it good for the economy? What are the consequences of the rate going up and down? So we can have that discussion. Here is I think the coup de grace that undermines the whole notion that the government can spend without a formal amendment to the Constitution, since none of this is authorized by Article 1, Section 8. We go to the 18th Amendment. After 1 year from the ratification of this article, the manufacture, sale, or transportation of intoxicating liquors within, the importation thereof into, or the exportation thereof from the United States and all territories subject to the jurisdiction thereof for beverage purposes is hereby prohibited. Prohibition. Why did they have to pass a constitutional amendment to prohibit the manufacture and sale of liquor because it's not authorized in the Constitution. They had to amend the Constitution in order to give the federal government the authority to ban alcohol. In 1937, they banned marijuana. They didn't pass the Constitution. This was probably the last amendment where the people in the United States said, we have to amend the Constitution because it's not consistent with the Constitution. This is such a powerful indictment of government activity. If you want something that's not authorized, you've got to amend the Constitution. I think this is the most powerful lesson about law and the Supreme Court and the Congress. You just can't willy-nilly pass something. And now, of course, we have executive orders on both sides of the aisle. Create a law, just write an executive order. Where does that come from? Okay, here's what I want to talk about for the next few minutes. Why do we have social spending? It's certainly not in the Constitution. So again, I've read all the material that I'm going to share with you, and we're going to talk about the origins of the welfare state. Where did that idea come from? Mutual aid societies. How did people get together locally to solve problems that people had, without the federal, state, or local governments? Dependent on DC and strengthening nonprofits. There's one essay, that's Rothbard's essay, and there are two books, David Beato and Charlotte Twite, and Peter Drucker's Wall Street Journal op-ed. I want to go over the summary of these material. They're very powerful, written by scholars. These are all professors. This is not written by politicians. These are people who went into the archives, went into the historical record to come up with, how did we get to a $7 trillion budget? What was the journey from literally no spending in the early 20th century? The total federal budget at the eve of the Great Depression, the total federal budget was $2.9 billion. The federal government is spending that less in 24 hours. Even if you account for inflation and population growth, we're nowhere near the size and scope of the federal government from 1929. What did Rothbard say in this essay? And you can Google this and read it online. It's a 50-page essay that goes into the history from the 1820s to the establishment of Social Security. The basic point that Rothbard makes, and this is where social history and public policy intersect, and he points out that there was a revival religious movement in the 1820s, starting in New England, that spread through the Midwest of the United States. And what was the point of this movement? They were concerned about, and they wanted to establish the kingdom of God in America. That was their mission, the kingdom of God in America. Well, how do you do that? They said, we got to wipe out sin. So what's one of the sinful things that people do? They drink. So 100 years later, we get prohibition. So it takes a long time for some of these ideas to percolate into policy. What else is sinful? Working on the Sabbath. So that's when we got a lot of blue laws from the colonies, because it was written on blue paper, that's why they call it blue laws, of no activity on the Sabbath. And we have to use the public schools to make sure that the children are good Christian children, Protestants. This is the 1830s, 1840s. This is the beginning of the parochial school movement in the United States, where Catholic parents said, I don't want my kids being indoctrinated to a religious order that I don't agree with. So they took their kids out of the schools and put them in the parochial schools. So again, Rothbard gives us this overview. In addition, and here's something really fascinating, how the economics profession was critical in the establishment of the idea that it's up to the federal government to provide social services to people. Richard Elley, a young economist from Wisconsin, went to Prussia and got a PhD in Prussia. And what were they teaching in Prussia? The welfare state is something that should be established in every country. He comes back to the United States. Remember, there's no PhD program in the United States at this time. So many young Americans went to study overseas to get a PhD degree. He comes back, he establishes the American Economic Association, which is the premier economic organization in the United States, and people get educated in the whole concept of government social services. And one of the students in the late 1800s, late 1800s, is one person called Woodrow Wilson. Many of the people from the FDR administration also start learning about the so-called benefits of the welfare state. So in this essay, Rothbard gives us the genesis of the welfare perspective of government, that government has to be involved in social services. While David Beto in From Mutual Aid to the Welfare State, a magnificent book that outlines how mutual aid societies, local organizations providing what the government is now doing, unemployment insurance, health benefits, everything you can name that government now does in the name of social services, the mutual aid societies were doing totally voluntarily. They were fraternal, they were religious, they were ethnic, all based upon the concept of reciprocity. And the thing that Beato points out is that in order to participate in these organizations, you had to show good moral character and behave so you don't do self-inflicted wounds. So he points out this is how individuals from every ethnic, religious, racial background were able to provide for their own members in a non-coercive way through voluntarism. This was the ultimate voluntarism aspect of American society. In fact, when de Tocqueville came to visit the United States, one thing that impressed him about the United States was the voluntarism that was going on throughout the United States. Years ago, I read an article that said that 80 or 85% of the world's philanthropic giving are made by Americans. That's stunning, because the welfare state concept has been occurring in Europe for many decades, well before the United States. And Charlotte Twight, in Dependent on DC, makes the point that the American people have become so dependent on on federal largesse, which is really taxpayer largesse, that she explains this, as does Beto and Rothbard, that this is a form of social control. Because if the government's giving you $1, there are going to be strings attached to it, that you have to do certain things in order to get that dollar from the federal government. And the last piece is one of my favorite articles from the Wall Street Journal. In fact, it's probably one of the best pieces ever written about social policy, by Peter Drucker, who was a management professor for many decades, a management consultant. And the last 20 years of his life, he lived to the ripe old age of 95, he spent consulting with nonprofits. And in the Wall Street Journal, he pointed out, and this is a direct quote, "Government has proved incompetent at solving social problems." And in the conclusion of this essay, he points out in 1969, he wrote a book that privatization of government assets would be the best way for countries to get out of the stagflation that they're in, the stagnation that they're in. And critics said that's never going to happen. And of course, privatization has swept throughout the world, in East Europe and other South America, and so on and so forth. He also points out this is what we need to do with the social service sector of the United States. We need to replace the government welfare state with what he calls non-profitization. The infrastructure is already in place. Look what we have here in Naples: the Neighborhood Health Clinic, Habitat for Humanity, the Harry Chapin Food Bank. The list goes on and on and on, all with voluntary contributions. So the point is, there is already in place the opportunity to reduce the federal budget in a very humane, positive way, without punishing anybody, without taking away anything from anybody, and getting rid of the bureaucracy. Remember, if someone is pushing paper in Washington, D.C., in the Department of Education, how many kids are they educating? 0. How many patients are people in Medicare and Medicaid bureaucracy treating patients? 0. So I'm going to get into how we get to that point. So this is the beginning in the growth of the welfare state over the last literally 140 years. Okay, what the Supreme Court had to weigh in on all this. The first case is 1895. There was a law passed, a tariff law, which also included direct taxation. Pollock sued the Farmers Loan and Trust Company, went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said, you cannot tax people directly because it's not authorized by the Constitution. So in 1895, the Supreme Court understood, or the members of the Supreme Court understood, that you cannot impose a tax if it's not authorized. Speed it up, we get the agitation for the income tax. The debate over the income tax was very interesting. It was, let's reduce tariffs, which hurt low and middle income families at the time, and impose an income tax on what? Wealthy people. That was the trade-off. So we got the income tax because the Supreme Court adhered to its obligation to make sure that laws passed conform with the Constitution. Now here are two important, let me get my notes for you because this is fascinating. And it just shows you how duplicitous people in government can be on both sides of the aisle. Helvering versus Davis. This was 2 years after the Social Security Act was passed and signed by Roosevelt in 1935, August 1935. Helvering said, this doesn't make any sense. Where's the authorization for a retirement benefit from the Constitution? Remember, prior to this, the Supreme Court was declaring unconstitutional a whole bunch of FDR's regulations. They were just saying, it's not authorized by the Constitution, you can't do it. Roosevelt, to use a technical term, really got pissed off. He said, well, if anyone turns 70 on the Supreme Court, I'm going to add a member. Supreme Court justices said, this is not good, to quote, pack the court. So when this case went to the Supreme Court, they acquiesced and said the Social Security Act is constitutional, even though there is no authority. Now here is the debate that is in a wonderful monograph called The Roots of the Social Security Myth by John Atarian. Again, you can Google that, The Roots of the Social Security Myth by John Atarian, heavily footnoted. Here's the point that he makes, which is fascinating. He said the FDR cabinet members and advisors were testifying in Congress, making speeches, that this is just like insurance from your private insurance company, and it's going to be an annuity, just like from a private insurance company. When they went to the Supreme Court to argue the case, they said, no, it's not insurance, it is a tax. And since the federal government has the power to tax, it's okay. And the Supreme Court agreed with that. So they were speaking from two sides of their mouth. One is to try to make it palatable to the American people, because the American people understood insurance and they understood annuities. But it wasn't that. Okay. The next one is the unemployment insurance, which is Stewart Machine versus Davis, which then the Supreme Court ruled as well. Now here's, the cat is out of the bag in the 1960 case, Fleming versus Nestor. Fleming was the Secretary of Health and Education and Welfare, which is now HHS, Health and Human Services. I've got to read this to you because this is fascinating. When I came across this many years ago, I said, this explains why we have a problem. Let me just get that for you. Here it is. The Supreme Court case Fleming versus Nestor is a landmark decision defining the legal nature of Social Security benefits. The case involved Ephraim Nestor, a Bulgarian immigrant who had lived and worked in the United States for many years and paid Social Security taxes. So therefore he's, quote, entitled to Social Security benefits, right? No. After retiring, he began receiving benefits. However, he was later deported for having been a member of the Communist Party. as permitted under federal law at the time. A provision of the Social Security Act terminated benefits for deported individuals, and the government stopped Nestor's payments. Obviously he challenged the termination of his benefits, since he supposedly earned them in good faith as a what? A working American, right? The government took the taxes, they promised you benefits, and yet the Social Security Act disallowed it. The Supreme Court rejected he claimed he had a contractual or property right to receive benefits. He claimed that ending his payments violated the Due Process Clause of the Fifth Amendment. The Supreme Court rejected his argument in a 5-4 decision. The court held that Social Security benefits are not contractual rights or accrued property rights in the traditional sense. Instead, they are statutory benefits that Congress may alter, amend, or even eliminate. In other words, this year, Congress could eliminate Social Security, according to this decision. Politically, it would be a disaster for members of Congress who did it, but legally, they have that right. And we know Social Security has changed over the years. It used to be, tax-free, then it became taxable under Reagan. Okay. The rates have gone up. The first Social Security tax was 1% of $3,000, and the people swore it's not going to go up. And now it's up to $150,000, something like that a year, 6.25%. Okay. This is one of the most important decisions of the Supreme Court, because what the court said is that even though you paid in what appears to be an earned benefit, we can change it. That's like any investment company where you put money in a 401k and IRA, and you rob a bank, and the company says, hey, you're a criminal now. We're not going to give you the money because you're a criminal. You're a bad character. Well, you own that money because you have a contract with the company, whether it's Fidelity or any other company. You have a contractual right, and it's your property. Fifth Amendment. No private property can take for public use without just compensation. So this case is one important. The next one, of course, is Obamacare, NFIB versus Sebelius, the National Federation of Independent Business. I don't want to get into that. That's a whole separate issue. But the point is, in a 5-4 decision, the Supreme Court ruled that Obamacare is legal because it's a tax. Justice Roberts was the deciding vote on that. Okay. So, in other words, the Supreme Court established that federal social welfare programs are constitutional under Congress's taxing and spending authority. But that is disingenuous, ladies and gentlemen. If it's not authorized explicitly, it's not enumerated in Article 1, Section 8, you can't spend money. Remember, it's a Supreme Court opinion. 9 people determining what the laws of the land should be. That, I think, is a real issue that we should have a discussion about. Okay. What did Thomas Jefferson, since we're coming up to the 25th anniversary of the Declaration, what did Thomas Jefferson say about taxes and spending? This is from his first inaugural address in 1801. Whoops, sorry about that. A wise and frugal government which shall restrain men from injuring one another, everyone can agree with that, okay, shall leave them otherwise free to regulate their own pursuits of industry and improvement, and shall not take from the mouth of labor the bread it has earned. Sounds like he was in favor of a zero income tax. That's what it sounds like to me. I don't know of any other interpretation. But here's the one that I think is really important regarding government spending. To compel a man to furnish funds, now of course we'd have to amend it to compel a man or a woman to furnish funds for the propagation of ideas he disbelieves and abhors is sinful and tyrannical. What is he saying here? Freedom of conscience. If the government is spending money on something that you don't like, on whatever issue it is, whether it's education, healthcare, you name it, it is an abomination according to Jefferson. Does anyone spend money on things you hate? Of course not. You only buy things that give you what? Satisfaction. As Mick Jagger told us in 1965, right? You want satisfaction in life. And you buy things because it gives you satisfaction. But when the government spends our money, okay, and April 15th is next month, in 3 weeks, and it supports all that spending. Okay, so here's my solution. How do we return to a constitutional federal budget? This would be primarily for young people, okay? Not we, the senior citizens at Sienna Lakes who are already collecting Social Security and Medicare. Your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren. What I propose is that they don't pay any Social Security taxes and payroll taxes and put that money in their own retirement account. Because the evidence shows at the average rate of return of 9%, which has been for 100 years in the stock market, the S&P 500, they would earn 9% a year over their lifetime. Ups and downs, it's 9% a year. Okay? That's just a fact. And that would allow them to fund their own retirement income and medical spending. Non-profitization of social welfare spending. This is Drucker's proposal. We write out a check or volunteer to our local nonprofit or a nonprofit wherever we think is doing a good job. That is part of freedom of conscience and freedom of spending our money. Okay? Okay. Abolish corporate and agricultural subsidies. Okay? We have markets to allocate resources. That's the best way to do it. Is it perfect? No, there's no such thing as perfection. Only in baseball, right? There's a perfect game, or bowling a 300 game is a perfect game. But when it comes to human affairs, there's no such thing as perfection. So corporations, agricultural subsidies, that would eliminate a lot of money. Next, abolish grants to states, counties, cities, schools, districts, colleges, and universities. In other words, if Collier County wants to do X, Y, and Z, it should tax the people in X, Y, and Z if it wants to do so. Same thing with Naples. If Naples wants to do A, B, and C, it should use the taxing power. But I contend everything that the government does can be done by the private sector or the nonprofit sector. Think of all the things that government does. Healthcare, education. We have nonprofits doing that. We have profits institutions doing that. So all of these activities, if you will, that give us satisfaction, that don't oppress our conscience, we can do in a very harmonious way. And of course, for the rest of us, abolishing the income and payroll taxes, not immediately, but over time. And this will be done pretty quickly. Let me give you an example. Let's say you're a retiree, and I'm just throwing out a number just to show you how this can be done. Let's say you pay $30,000 a year in federal income taxes, and you get $30,000 in Social Security benefits. So your right pocket is giving to the government, but it's giving you back in your left pocket, which means you need a whole bureaucracy for Social Security and the IRS to do that. That's not efficient. So what I propose is whatever you pay in income taxes, that your Social Security gets credited to that, and you don't pay you don't get Social Security, but you don't pay the income tax. That, I think, is a frictionless way to make us not have to file a tax form. Okay? And of course, one of my favorites is end all foreign aid. Okay? Do we want money to go to country A, B, C, or D? Well, why? I mean, all the resources that countries have can be used to the best of their ability. Why do they need the taxpayers of the United States subsidizing their activities? This is a fundamental philosophical issue. This is not a political issue. This is a philosophical issue. What is the role of government given our Constitution and the legacy of the Declaration of Independence? That's really the debate we should be having as we get closer to July 4th, 2026. Next, here's quiz time. Okay? I hope you're taking notes because this is going to be on the final exam. Okay? Nothing is more precious than independence and liberty. Sounds like a founding father, doesn't it? A founding father may have said that. But ironically, it's somebody we, fought against. Ho Chi Minh, the leader of North Vietnam. This is the irony of that statement. Okay. I think this sums it all up. And let me leave you with one last quote, which I mentioned 2 months ago. And this is very apropos today's climate. The first panacea for a mismanaged nation is inflation of the currency, which is happening right now, as I pointed out in my presentation. The second is war. Both bring a temporary prosperity, both bring a permanent ruin. Both are the refuge of political and economic opportunists. Not a public official, not an economist, not a historian, well, maybe a historian. Ernest Hemingway, who saw a lot in the 20th century. The bottom line is we live in the age of the non sequitur. People who support the welfare state's argument goes like this. People need fill in the blank, food, clothing, housing, income, therefore there should be a government program. In other words, the conclusion is not logical from the what? Premise. If you take that argument to its logical conclusion, the government should control everything. Food stores, like the mayor of New York City wants to have government food stores, or government takeover of healthcare. Remember, healthcare is how much is healthcare now? It's nearly $5 trillion a year. And the American people are not getting any healthier with all these expenditures. So the evidence is, I think, overwhelming from a constitutional perspective, from an economic analysis perspective, from a historical perspective, that the Constitution should be adhered to by both sides of the aisle. Okay, you got that side, you got this side. And if we had that, we wouldn't have a $7 trillion budget, we wouldn't have a $39 trillion debt. Unfortunately, here we are. What I'm proposing is a way out of this. Not for us so much, but for your children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren and unborn generations. Because if not, there's going to be a lot of, unintended consequences of what's happened for the past 100 so odd years. So with that, thank you for listening, and I'd be happy to take any questions.